All right, so we've got this pretty hefty stack of Turkish legal documents in front of us. It looks like we're going to be really diving deep into how these laws, especially those around data protection, are impacting the everyday lives of people and professionals over in Turkey.
Yeah, it's a really, really fascinating area to explore, I think, because it touches on so many different aspects of daily life for everyone.
Yeah.
Everything from healthcare to marketing to just using the internet.
Yeah, and it looks like we've got excerpts from all sorts of things, the Turkish Constitution, the Penal Code, and then a whole bunch of laws and regulations on data protection. We even have some internal procedures, looks like, from the Personal Data Protection Board. It's like a whole crash course in Turkish law here.
It really is. And it all kind of goes back to a really fundamental principle that you see enshrined in the personal data protection law, which is that your personal data in Turkey can't be processed without you specifically giving consent. This is like right there in Article 5.1.
Hmm.
And it's a really big deal for individual control over information.
So basically, like, companies and organizations can't just grab my data and use it without asking first. I mean, that seems pretty straightforward, but I'm guessing it can't be that simple.
You're right. Yeah. Real life is always more complicated. So there are some exceptions to this rule, and you can find those outlined in Article 5 to the law. So, for example, if it's a matter of protecting someone's life, like think emergency medical care, then consent isn't actually required.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. In a life or death situation, they can't exactly wait for me to sign a waiver or something before they can help me out. So what are some of the other exceptions then?
Well, fulfilling a contract is another one. So if you sign up for a service online, they can go ahead and process your data in order to make good on that agreement. And then, of course, if the law specifically requires it, then they might not need your consent. It's all about trying to find that balance, between protecting individual rights and just letting things function as they need to.
So it's not like the law is trying to shut everything down. It's more about making sure that organizations are acting responsibly and being open and honest about how they use people's data.
Right, exactly. That focus on consent is really about shifting the power dynamic. It makes these organizations accountable to the individual, and it forces them to be a lot more upfront about what they're actually doing with your data.
I see. Okay. That brings up something I was thinking about. So Turkey also has a right to information law, and that guarantees the right to request information from public institutions. But then how does that work if they have these really strict data protection laws as well? I feel like those two things could end up clashing.
It's a really interesting tension there. And the laws actually do address that possible conflict. Article 9 of the Right to Information Law specifically talks about when a requested document has both confidential and public information in it. In those cases, they have to remove the sensitive parts and release the rest.
That just seems like a logistical nightmare, though, right? I mean, who decides what's confidential and what's not? It just seems really subjective.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge for sure. The law gives some guidance, but ultimately, figuring out what exactly counts as confidential information takes a lot of careful consideration.
Yeah.
And sometimes the right to information gets blocked completely. That's covered in Articles 17 through 19.
Okay, so what kind of stuff would be completely off limits then? Just so I can get an idea.
Well, anything that could harm national security or get in the way of ongoing investigations is protected. And Article 17 also says they can't release information about the state's economic interests if it could cause harm or lead to unfair competition.
So there are some limits then. It's not just a free-for-all. There's some checks and balances in place to protect sensitive information and just to make sure the right to information isn't being abused.
Right. It really is like a balancing act, trying to keep both transparency and protection in mind. And actually, speaking of transparency, Turkey also has a system called V-Verify to keep track of data processing activities.
Virbais, what's that?
So VBIAS stands for the Data Controllers Registry. It's basically a database where all these organizations are required to register their data processing activities. And all of that's laid out in the regulation on the Data Controllers Registry.
So it's kind of like a public record of, who's collecting what data and for what reason.
Exactly. It's all about promoting that transparency and accountability. Of course, there are exceptions, as always, like certain activities, things related to crime prevention or auditing by public institutions are exempt from registration. But overall, VBVAS has been a big step towards making those data processing activities much more visible and making sure everyone's following the rules.
I could see how that would be really important for professionals who are, working with personal data on a regular basis. People in healthcare, marketing, HR, stuff like that.
Oh, absolutely. They really need to be aware of VBOs and how it impacts their jobs. This whole regulation just really underscores how seriously Turkey is taking data protection and what it means for people's lives.
Yeah, it's not just some abstract legal concept. It's really about how these laws are shaping the way we're living and working, especially in a world that's becoming so digital.
And to make sure those laws are being implemented correctly, Turkey's got a new professional role too. They're called personal data protection experts.
Oh, wow. Okay, now we're talking.
Hmm.
Tell me more about these data protection experts. What do they do?
So the regulation on personal data protection expertise basically lays out everything you need to know about this new role, including, by the way, the very strict requirements for getting certified.
Strict, huh?
Yeah,
So we're not talking about some quick online course and certificate you can print out at home.
no, not at all. Article 17 says you need 3 years of relevant experience. You have to have a thesis that's successfully defended. There's a competency exam and even language proficiency requirements. They're not playing around.
Wow, they're really setting the bar high there. But what do these experts actually do, on a daily basis? What's their role in all of this?
Well, their duties are outlined in Article 27, and it goes way beyond just paperwork, believe me. They do research, they keep an eye on new regulations and board decisions, they take part in international meetings, and even help develop data protection strategies.
So they're not just like enforcers then. They're actually helping to shape how organizations are approaching data protection in Turkey.
Exactly, and it shows how important this expertise is becoming in a world that's, so intertwined with technology these days.
It makes me wonder, is this a possible career path for our listeners? Or maybe for someone they know?
It's definitely a growing field, and it shows a real shift, I think, from just collecting and protecting data to thinking about what happens to it afterwards.
You mean like when I want my data back?
Right.
Or if a company doesn't need it anymore? It's not just like deleted into the void, right?
Not quite. There's a whole regulation for that. It's called the Regulation on the Deletion, Destruction, or Anonymization of Personal Data.
Okay, so deleting data isn't as easy as just hitting the delete key. What are we talking about here? Like giant shredders for hard drives, digital bonfires?
It's not quite that dramatic, but it is a really serious process with very clearly defined steps.
I see. Okay, so what does this regulation actually entail then?
Well, first off, it's important to define the terms. So Article 4 of the regulation defines all the key terms like destruction, personal data processing inventory, and data controller, just to make sure everyone's on the same page.
Right, no room for any ambiguity there. But what about the actual processes for, deleting, destroying, or anonymizing that data?
Well, Article 5 lays out the general principles. So data controllers are required to have specific policies and procedures for handling data deletion and destruction. And here's the kicker. They have to keep records of everything they do for at least 3 years.
Wow, a digital paper trail for every bit of data that's deleted or destroyed.
Exactly. And it's not just about having those policies. They actually have to be transparent about them, too. They're required to explain the methods they're using for deletion and destruction in their public policies and procedures.
So theoretically, I could go to a company's website and find out exactly how they're handling my data when they no longer need it.
You got it. That's a level of transparency that we honestly don't see very often.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And it really shows that shift towards empowering individuals when it comes to their own personal data. Knowing that your data can actually be deleted under certain conditions is a big deal.
It is. But it does make you wonder how effective those processes really are, right?
Yeah, just because a company says they're deleting my data, it doesn't necessarily mean it's gone forever. Digital footprints can be tough to get rid of completely.
You're absolutely right. And that kind of leads us to another really crucial aspect of these laws, the human element. We've been talking a lot about the technical and procedural side of data protection. But what happens when things go wrong? What happens when someone actually misuses personal data?
Yeah, that's a great point. We've been really deep in the weeds here, but ultimately these laws are about protecting people. So what are the actual consequences when someone misuses that data?
Well, that's where the Turkish Penal Code comes in. It outlines a bunch of offenses related to data misuse and also the penalties for those actions.
Okay, so now we're getting to the good stuff. What happens when someone crosses the line?
Right. So, for instance, Article 217A of the Penal Code is all about publicly disseminating misleading information, specifically when it's done with the intent to cause panic or disruption. Think spreading fake news or just deliberately putting out misleading information to try and manipulate people.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that seems super relevant these days, with misinformation spreading so quickly online.
Yeah, exactly. And Article 218 specifically deals with inciting hatred and animosity, against individuals or groups based on things like religion, ethnicity, or gender.
So it's not just about protecting the data itself then. It's also about protecting people from the harm that can happen when that data is misused.
Precisely. And the penalties for these offenses, well, they vary depending on the specific offense and the circumstances. But overall, the Turkish Penal Code is pretty clear that data misuse is taken very seriously. And Article 82 lays out what are called aggravating circumstances that can lead to even harsher penalties.
Aggravating circumstances.
Yeah.
So the punishment isn't always the same for a given crime. What kinds of things would influence that then?
Well, for example, if the misuse of data was planned in advance, it was premeditated, or if it specifically targeted someone vulnerable, that would be considered an aggravating circumstance. And that could lead to a much more severe punishment.
I see. So it's not just about what happened, but also about the intent behind it and how it could potentially impact the victim.
Exactly. Are there any examples in the penal code that you think might surprise our listeners? Stuff that they wouldn't necessarily expect to see addressed in a legal document?
Oh, for sure. The Turkish Penal Code is incredibly comprehensive. It covers a really wide range of offenses. Like, for example, Article 90 lays out all these strict rules about scientific experiments on humans. It requires voluntary and informed consent and makes sure that the participant's well-being is protected. Wow, okay. That's pretty forward-thinking.
It is. And here's another one that might surprise you. Article 98 actually criminalizes the failure to help someone in need.
Wait, really? So if you see someone in danger and you don't help them, you could actually be breaking the law?
It's not quite as simple as that. There are some specific criteria that have to be met. But it does show how the Turkish Penal Code is going beyond just individual rights. It's also considering the responsibilities we have to each other as members of a society.
That's really interesting. It paints a picture of a society that values both individual rights and collective well-being.
Exactly. And it's all about finding that balance, right?
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, from the Constitution to the Penal Code. And it seems like there's a common thread running through all of it, striking that balance between protecting individuals and keeping society functioning smoothly.
You nailed it. These laws are complex and detailed, but they ultimately reflect a real commitment to finding that delicate balance.
And it's just fascinating to see how those efforts are playing out in this digital age, especially when it comes to data protection.
It's definitely a rapidly evolving landscape, and Turkey's approach offers a lot of valuable insights into how societies are, grappling with these challenges all over the world.
It's clear that these laws aren't just abstract legal texts. They're having a real impact on how people live and work in Turkey.
Absolutely. And this topic's only going to become more and more important as technology keeps advancing.
Okay, so we've only scratched the surface here, but I think we've got a good foundation to build on. We'll be back to dive deeper into all of these implications in the next part of our deep dive.
Looking forward to it. It's really fascinating how these Turkish laws are kind of like wrestling with these seemingly contradictory ideas, right? Like on the one hand, they're trying to protect personal data, but then on the other hand, they also acknowledge that sometimes you just need access to information.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope, right? You want to give people control over their own information, but you also have to make sure the government can be transparent
I'd
and,
say.
the justice can be served.
Exactly. And it's not all just theory either. These laws have a real impact on people's lives in Turkey.
That's what I'm really curious about, yeah. How do these laws actually play out in different areas of life?
Yeah.
Like, for example, how does the personal data protection law affect healthcare? I mean, doctors and hospitals deal with some incredibly sensitive information.
Oh, it has a huge impact, for sure. Under this law, healthcare providers can't share any patient data without getting explicit consent, unless it's, an emergency or if the law specifically requires it.
Okay, so that means no more just casually sharing medical records, right? No gossiping about patients in the break room.
Yeah, definitely not without facing some serious legal consequences. And this applies to other sectors, too. Take marketing and advertising, for example. Companies in Turkey have to be a lot more careful about how they collect and use data for those purposes.
So, like, no more spam calls from random companies I've never even heard of.
Well, ideally, that's the goal, right? Companies need to be upfront about what data they're collecting, and they need to get your permission before they can use it for marketing.
That's a win for consumers, for sure. Nobody likes to feel like their information is just being used without their knowledge or consent.
Right. But then what about the professionals who work in these fields? How are their jobs changing because of all these data protection laws?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, it creates a whole bunch of challenges, but also some new opportunities. So professionals who handle personal data on a regular basis, people like HR managers or marketers, now have to really know these laws inside and out. They need to understand all these concepts like data minimization, purpose limitation, and data security.
So it's not just about knowing the rules then, but also about really understanding why they're there and how to apply them in real-world situations.
Exactly. And this has led to a big demand for people with expertise in data protection. Remember those personal data protection experts we were talking about before?
Oh, yeah. The data protection gurus with all the fancy certifications.
Well, businesses and organizations in Turkey are really looking for people like that. These experts can help them navigate all these complex laws, help them develop policies and just make sure that personal data is being handled responsibly.
Sounds like a pretty good career path right now.
It is, for sure, especially since these laws are only going to get more complex as time goes on. That demand for data protection expertise is only going to keep growing.
It's amazing how one law, the personal data protection law, can have such a ripple effect across so many different sectors and professions.
Yeah, it shows how powerful legislation can be. It's shaping not just individual behavior, but also the practices of entire businesses and organizations. And it's not just about data protection either. The Turkish Penal Code also plays a big role in protecting people from harm.
That's true. We were talking about some of those offenses related to data misuse, but the penal code covers way more than that. It's got a ton of stuff in there about offenses that impact the everyday lives of people in Turkey. Everything from protecting their privacy at home to safeguarding public health.
Yeah, it's a seriously comprehensive document. Let's look at a few examples that our listeners might find relevant, like crimes against property. How does the Turkish Penal Code deal with things like theft or fraud?
Oh yeah, everyone's been affected by that at some point. We've all heard stories about theft or scams. How does Turkish law approach those situations?
Well, the Penal Code's very thorough in how it deals with property crimes. For example, Article 141 defines theft and then outlines a bunch of different aggravating circumstances that could lead to harsher penalties.
Aggravating circumstances. So stealing, like a candy bar, is different from stealing someone's entire life savings.
Exactly. Things like how much was stolen, how it was stolen, whether there was any violence or threats involved. All those factors contribute to how the crime is punished.
So it's not just about what was stolen, but also about the context, the circumstances surrounding the theft. What about fraud then? How does the Turkish Penal Code define that?
Article 157's got that covered. It gives a pretty clear definition of fraud, which basically boils down to intentionally deceiving someone to gain an unfair advantage, usually financially.
Okay, so we're talking about things like scams, identity theft, financial schemes, that kind of thing.
Yep, exactly. And just like with theft, the Penal Code also lists those aggravating circumstances for fraud.
So like running a little con game is seen differently than orchestrating a massive Ponzi scheme.
Precisely. The scale of the fraud, the methods used, who the victims are, all that stuff can influence how severe the punishment is.
It's interesting how the Penal Code takes those little nuances into account. It's not just about these black and white definitions of crimes. It's about really understanding the specific circumstances and the impact it has on the people involved.
You're right. It really emphasizes that these actions have real consequences, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Yeah. And that attention to detail, it's also evident in how the Penal Code deals with a whole range of other offenses, too, from the really minor stuff to the truly awful things. But what about crimes against individuals? How does Turkish law protect people from, physical or emotional harm?
Well, we already mentioned things like inciting hatred and animosity, but the Penal Code also covers offenses like assault, battery, and even psychological violence.
So it's not just about physical harm, then. Emotional and psychological abuse are recognized as crimes in Turkey as well.
Absolutely. The Penal Code acknowledges how serious those types of abuse are. And when it comes to deciding on the appropriate punishment, it considers things like how much harm was caused and what the relationship is between the victim and the abuser.
I see. So like a domestic violence case would probably be treated differently than, say, a bar fight between two strangers.
Exactly. The Turkish legal system is trying to make sure that victims are protected and that justice is served, and they recognize that every situation is different.
Okay, that makes sense. It's reassuring to know that the law is there to protect people from all sorts of harm, both physical and emotional. But what about crimes that don't necessarily involve, like, a specific individual? What about things that threaten public order or safety?
Well, the Turkish Penal Code has a whole category for those kinds of offenses, too. Like Article 170 deals with crimes against public safety, things like causing a fire or a flood or any other dangerous situation that could put lives or property at risk.
The things like arson, reckless driving, or maybe even neglecting safety protocols at work?
Exactly. The Penal Code recognizes that even though these things might not be directed at any one person, they can still have really serious consequences for the whole community.
That's true. I mean, a fire in a public building could hurt or even kill a lot of people, and a chemical spill could pollute a whole ecosystem.
Right. And the Turkish legal system takes that very seriously. The goal is to prevent those kinds of things from happening by making sure the consequences are, appropriate.
It sounds like the Turkish Penal Code is really designed to protect individuals, property, and public order, all in a very comprehensive way. It's a complex document for sure, but it reflects the values of Turkish society and, their commitment to justice.
Yeah, and it's important to keep in mind that the Penal Code isn't set in stone either. It's always evolving to address new challenges and reflect how society is changing.
That makes sense. The laws have to keep up with the times, especially in a world that's changing so quickly like ours.
Absolutely. And as technology keeps advancing, we're going to see new types of crimes emerging.
Yeah.
So we can expect the Turkish Penal Code and other legal systems around the world to keep developing and adapting.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, but we're just scratching the surface of a much bigger conversation about how the law is shaping our lives, both online and offline.
Definitely. These laws and regulations aren't just words on paper. They really do have a real impact on how we live, how we work, and how we interact with each other.
And understanding these laws, it's crucial for anyone who's living or working in Turkey, or anyone who's just interested in how different societies are approaching the challenges of this digital age. What are some other areas of Turkish law we should look at to get a better grasp of this?
It's pretty amazing, right, how these Turkish legal documents are tackling not just our physical safety and well-being, but also like our digital lives.
It really is. Like they're trying to build this whole legal framework for a world where, the lines between physical and digital are getting blurrier all the time.
Yeah, exactly. And that's especially clear in the regulations around that data controllers registry, the RBS, that we were talking about earlier.
Right. It's like shining a light on this whole world of data processing that can be so secretive sometimes. Companies can't just hide behind their algorithms and their confusing terms of service anymore.
Right. They have to actually tell people what they're doing with their data.
It seems like that whole wild west of data collection is like becoming a regulated territory now.
That's a great way to put it. And that shift has created a whole bunch of new responsibilities for professionals, especially in fields like healthcare, marketing, HR, anywhere where they're working with personal data all the time.
Yeah, and let's not forget about those personal data protection experts we were talking
Yep.
about. It seems like they're the ones who are becoming like the sheriffs of the data protection world.
They really are. They're playing a crucial role in guiding organizations through all these laws, advising on everything from, data processing policies to impact assessments and all that stuff.
It really shows how seriously Turkey is taking this whole data protection thing. It's not just about laws. It's about building this whole ecosystem of like expertise and oversight.
And it's about more than just protecting people from data breaches and all that. It's also about giving them the power to exercise their rights.
Right. We talked about the right to access and correct your own data. But what about like the right to be forgotten? Is that a thing in Turkey? Can people request to have their data deleted if they want to?
Oh, absolutely. The personal data protection law says they can under certain circumstances.
Like what? What are some situations where someone could actually request to have their data deleted?
Well, for example, if the data isn't needed anymore, like if it's not relevant to the reason it was collected in the first place, or if the person just withdraws their consent, or if the data was processed illegally to begin with.
So if I sign up for some service and then later I decide I don't want to use it anymore, I can just tell them to delete all my data.
Yeah, pretty much. It's a sign of how much more aware we're all becoming of data privacy these days, all around the world.
But I mean, putting those rights into practice, it can't always be that easy, right?
You're right. Having a law is one thing, but actually enforcing it and making sure companies are complying, that's a whole other challenge.
Exactly. And that's where the Personal Data Protection Board comes in, right?
Yep, that's them. They're the ones who are responsible for overseeing all of this, making sure everyone's playing by the rules.
So companies can't just, talk the talk when it comes to data protection. They have to actually walk the walk, too.
That's right. The board has some real power. They can investigate complaints, issue warnings, even impose fines on organizations that break the law.
Okay, good. But it's not all up to the government, is it? I mean, individuals also have a role to play in protecting their own data.
Oh, absolutely. Being aware of your rights and taking steps to protect your own privacy is so important.
So what are some things our listeners can do, practically speaking? How can they be more proactive about their data privacy?
Well, first of all, just be mindful of what information you're putting out there, online. Think before you post personal stuff on social media or sign up for services that want a ton of your data.
So be careful about who you trust with your data. Don't just click agree on every privacy policy that pops up.
Exactly. And if you're not sure about how a company handles data, just ask them. You have the right to know. And if you don't like their answer, remember, you can always file a complaint with the Personal Data Protection Board.
So you do have options.
Yeah,
And you shouldn't be afraid to use them to protect yourself.
exactly. This whole data protection thing is a shared responsibility. Individuals have to be proactive, companies have to be transparent, and the government has to make sure everything is being done right.
That's a great way to put it. It's a complex system, but it's all there to protect our rights in this digital age.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, I think this deep dive into Turkish law has been incredibly insightful. We've learned a lot.
We really have. I mean, we covered everything from like the basic ideas behind data protection to the complexities of the penal code. And it's clear that these laws have a huge impact on people's lives in Turkey, both in their personal lives and in their professional lives.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey. We've seen how these laws reflect a real commitment to, protecting individual rights, making sure justice is served, and just navigating this rapidly changing world that we live in.
Definitely. And as we wrap up, the question for our listeners is this. What do these Turkish laws mean for you? How do they compare to the laws in your own country? And what can you do to be a more informed and empowered citizen in this digital age? It's definitely something to think about as we all try to make sense of this increasingly complex world.
Well said. It's been a pleasure diving deep into this with you.
Likewise. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.